Today I'd like to share with you how we can take something like this and break it down to where we can fully understand what's going on by diving deeply into the fundamentals of jazz theory. With a strong understanding of theory, you'll not only be able to understand what you are hearing, but it will enrich your own improvisations as well. Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Joe Gilman. During my career as a jazz pianist, I've toured and recorded with musicians like Bobby Hutcherson, Joe Henderson, and Jeff Tain Watts. I'm also a professor at American River College and California State University in Sacramento, and formerly I was the music director at the Brubeck Institute, where I taught musicians like Chad L.B., Joel Ross, Joe Sanders, Justin Brown, Glenn Zaleski, Lucas Pino, Noah Kelman, and Corey Fonville. All of the materials we'll discuss in this video come from a course I just launched with Jazz Lesson Videos, where we explore all of the essentials of jazz theory. If you'd like to dive deeper into these concepts, you can check out the full course found in the description below. All right, let's go ahead and dive into modes. So when an improviser is making an improvisation, they're kind of looking at several different tasks. One would be, what is it that you're improvising on? What kind of a style are we improvising in? And so we have lots of options there. One would be, is there a melody that I'm improvising on? Is there a chord structure that I'm improvising on? Is there a particular style I'm trying to play within? And so one of the tasks that an improviser eventually gets to is, here's a particular chord that I'm looking at and trying to provide an improvisation on. And what would be the scale that would go along with that? It's one of the options that you've got. And this is what we call chord-scale relationship. Here's a chord, like a major seventh chord or a dominant seventh chord. What would be the scale that would go along with that? In your own personal investigations, you might have been coming across different words, things like Ionian and Mixolydian, Dorian, things like that. If you haven't, we're going to talk about those today. So the first thing we're going to talk about is, what are these words and where do they come from? Let's have a brief discussion about modes, what those words mean and where they came from. The origin of the Greek modes goes back to several Greek theorists, philosophers, mathematicians, and musicians exploring the science and the ethos of music about 2,500 years ago. These scientists and writers were exploring many different aspects of music and how it could be structured, originally dealing mostly with the mathematics and the emotional aspects of sounds. Originally, tetrachords, which are four-note groupings of tones, were placed next to each other in different combinations to create what might be considered by today's standards scales. The different groupings were labeled based on different peoples and areas of Greece, most notably the Dorians and neighboring areas like Phrygia and Lydia and Locris. More around the area we now know as Italy, some of the main aspects of the Greek modal system that were retained were the names of the modes: Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, and Mixolydian. Most of the music that was developed around this time was based on these four modes and associated modes called hypermodes, which did not really carry beyond a few centuries. Remember, major and minor keys and scales did not exist at this time. Everything was in development. It was not until around the 15th century that two additional modes, the Ionian mode and the Aeolian mode, were suggested and came into favor. So we have the Ionian mode based on C, and the Aeolian mode based on A. Finally, around the Baroque period and the establishment of tonality with major and minor keys, the two final modes, Ionian and Aeolian, became what are now known today as the major and minor scale, and the other older modes fell out of favor. Most Western music was written around the major and minor scales for approximately 200 years, until the Impressionistic period with French composers such as Debussy and Ravel, who not only began to write in the other older church modes again, but also different types of scales, such as the whole tone scale and the pentatonic scale, as well as non-tonal harmonic resources. When American jazz became to be developed in the 20th century, the tonal system of European Western music was mixed with a non-Western African system of harmony, along with some of these impressionistic harmonies and scales. You can hear this beautiful marriage of sounds in ragtime music, early jazz, and the blues. Composers such as Duke Ellington and George Gershwin exemplify the epitome of this musical marriage. During the early days of jazz, modes in the early Western music sense were not really a topic of conversation. This was true pretty much through the bebop period. However, as some jazz musicians in the middle part of the 20th century began to become trained in Western music conservatories, or were influenced by musicians who were trained in conservatories, knowledge of the early Western music and the modes began to become a point of conversation. Musicians like George Russell and Miles Davis especially began to consider a construction of jazz composition not based on American popular harmonic progressions, but instead based on a series of modes, specifically Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, and Mixolydian. Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, and Mixolydian. This can be heard clearly in the late 50s works of people like George Russell, Miles Davis, and Bill Evans. John Coltrane also experimented significantly with modal jazz, especially in his works from the early 1960s. The development of modal jazz has even more to its history in the post-bop period, with musicians such as Wayne Shorter, Woody Shaw, Herbie Hancock, Bobby Hutcherson, but that will be a point of discussion for a future video. Okay, so now let's look at a couple of chord progressions and do a modal analysis and see what modes might be the best modal choices for these chords. You see the first chord progression goes like this: F minor 7, B flat 7, G minor 7, and C minor 7. So we've got a minor 7th, a dominant 7th, and 2 minor 7ths following. So as we know, our first choice that we can use anytime we have a minor 7th chord is Dorian. So on all of those minor 7th chords, we might choose Dorian. And then the middle chord on B flat 7 is a dominant 7th chord. So on that one, we could choose Mixolydian. So let's hear what that sounds like. Dorian, Mixolydian, Dorian, Dorian. Okay, that's all right. But you'll also notice that the first two chords, F minor and B flat 7, establish the tonality of E flat major. Even though E flat major never appears, the F minor to B flat 7 get us in the neighborhood of E flat major. So therefore, what about those other two chords, G minor to C7? Well, G minor 7th acts as a 3 chord in E flat major. And C minor acts as a 6 chord in the key of E flat major. So therefore, we might choose to use the third mode of E flat major on the G minor 7th chord, G Phrygian. And on the C minor chord, we might choose to use Aeolian because it's the 6th chord. So now we have Dorian, Mixolydian, Phrygian, and Aeolian. Those are some other options we have. Here's the next chord progression. We have a C major 7th chord, an E flat major 7th chord, an F sharp minor 9 chord, B flat minor 9, and a G dominant 7th. Okay, so in this case, we have the first two are major 7th chords, and so what we've learned is it's always safe to play Ionian on major 7th chords. So we might have Ionian, followed by Ionian. The next two chords are minor 9th chords. We've always learned that on minor chords, it's safe to use Dorian. So we might have F sharp Dorian, followed by B flat Dorian. And the final chord is G dominant 7th. We only have one choice at this point for dominant 7ths, and we've learned that on dominant 7ths we use Mixolydian. So it looks like our choices would be Ionian, Ionian, Dorian, Dorian, and Mixolydian. The next question would be, well, is there any tonality that's being established? Are there any dominant chords? Or are there any 2/5s that help us to see if any kind of a tonality or a key center is being established? That really doesn't happen in this case, as you can see. The only dominant 7th chord that shows up is at the end on a G7. And there's no minor chords or any major chords that formulate any kind of a 2/5 or a 2/5-1. So what we've really got here is a bunch of independent chords. So probably just improvising on the 3 main modes, Ionian, Dorian, and Mixolydian, would be our best choice. But an interesting artistic choice might be if we choose to use Lydian, possibly, on those 2 major chords. Now Dorian. Dorian. Mixolydian. All right, so again, that chord progression is a little bit more independent with no tonality established. I hope this collection of ideas, getting us through the modes, the different kinds of modes, all the different names, where it came from, and the application of all those modes helps you in this basic discussion about chord-scale relationship. Thanks for listening today. I hope these tools and concepts will give your composing, arranging, and improvising more depth and a larger palette of harmonic color. Use your best judgment to make your adaptations of these concepts to create interesting harmonic color and meet the musical and emotional goals of your creations. See you next time.